Hi everybody, welcome to the Museums Association's Virtual Conference 2020. I know that some people are still coming in, apologies for being a couple of moments late starting, but we're really excited and pleased to run this particular session as part of conference, and this is of course the launch of the Learning and Engagement Manifesto. My name's Rebecca from the Museums Association and I'll be facilitating today. Before I hand over to our chair, I just got a couple of quick housekeeping announcements to share. So firstly, obviously it's such a shame we're not all together in person, but the good news is we've got the chat function, which you can access on your menu bar, and you can use this to let people know that you're here, to say hi, to share your thoughts and experiences as well. You can also tweet using the hashtag Museums2020. We have got some time for questions today, so if you want to share that via the Q&A, please do, and ideally please keep those short and to the point so that we're able to get through as many as possible. The session's not going to be locked at any point, so if you need to leave or you lose connection, you can rejoin using the same link you joined originally with, and we are recording as well today, so do make sure you can take notes of course, but the video will be available on our website in due course. We've got speech text transcription provided by Stage Text, just click the closed captioning option in the menu bar. And we've also got audio description by Vocalize. I need to just quickly set that up once I hand over, but that will be available as well. If you require that. That's it from me. I'm going to disappear and leave our speakers in chair for the discussion. Thank you.
Rebecca, and hello everyone, and welcome to the launch of the Museums Association Learning and Engagement Manifesto. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our panel as well, who I'll shortly introduce. I'm excited to say, before we do anything else, that the manifesto has just gone live. It's now accessible on the Museums Association website, and Rebecca will be sharing a link in the chat. So please click on it, load it up, start talking about it in the chat as well, and we can use it as prompts for questions as we go through as well. It will also be available in Welsh as well. The Museums Association, Gem and Engage, and Art Fund are all sharing it across their social channels too, so please follow and join on social media, join in the conversation there using the hashtags Museums2020 and hashtag Museum Learning. Now, let me introduce myself. I'm Dictiona Tarakya-Perring, Head of Engagement and Skills at Somerset House, and also a Museums Association board member. And I had the privilege to lead on this work alongside David Anderson, who I will shortly introduce you to all, and Sharon Heal, the director of the Museums Association. Before introducing our international panel and starting the conversation, I wanted to set the scene of the journey so far to getting to this manifesto, launch of this manifesto. The manifesto has been in development for over 19 months, although I will admit the last 11 months have felt like 11 years, and that's nothing to say anything about David or Sharon there, mostly a pandemic. The manifesto has been developed by speaking to over 500 members across all 4 nations of the United Kingdom. We've had numerous case studies sent in, and it was very hard to narrow it down to the 8 brilliant ones that we have included as part of the manifesto. And thank you for all of you that shared your work with us, and please continue to do so over the years to come. The Museums Association Board has fully endorsed this manifesto, and that says a lot as well. As we have moved through 2020, a pandemic has hit us, and the impact of Black Lives Matter has made this manifesto even more important, and the work of learning and engagement and how it will be played out in the years to come even more important. It was our learning and engagement and digital teams that were looked at when we went into lockdown in March. We have seen decisions can be made much quicker than they were pre-2020. We have seen that we can be responsive to our communities and calls to action. But we also now, 8 months later, see learning and engagement teams at risk, and this is the case internationally. The anxiety and worry for those at risk should not be taken away by the launch of this manifesto. So if you're joining us today and you are at risk, our thoughts are with you, and thank you for spending this time with us. We also know it's a difficult time for all our organizations looking to survive and plan for a future that feels in flux. Flux is an interesting word because it can mean instability, but it can also mean fluidity. And if we take that meaning of fluidity as the meaning, then when we look forward and how we move forward, we'll make sure that we don't return to how things were done. Do we really want it to go back to how things were done? And we'll make the changes we need to as organizations. So learning engagement is at the core of all our work, and it's everyone's work. Manifesto is not a paper or a book, it's a manifesto. In speaking to the 500 members, we heard the need for a call to action around the work of learning and engagement. For those in learning and engagement departments to feel empowered, to be able to advocate and make the case of why the work they do is important. But as I said, it's not for one department, it's for everyone across the whole of an organization. So what you choose to do with this manifesto, if it's to be printed to go on your wall, probably your bedroom wall for now, or it becomes the basis of how you plan a future program idea, or how you show the director of your organization the real impact of learning and engagement programs you could have. It is there to support you and help you and advocate, to make the case you don't have to commit to all of it straight away. If it's easier to take one manifesto point and focus on that, and over time do the rest, then do that. But mostly it's there as a guide, a simple, clear way to do what you already do and what you want to do, but know there is a manifesto right behind you to support you, but also challenge you. One thing we all agree on is that, and it's come through very strongly in the conference this week, is that it's important in what we do and how we do, not just the words we say. And today, as we reflect with our international colleagues about the manifesto, as they show you how it relates to their work, what they're taking from it, I promise you we are sharing you real work, real things that are happening, not just words of what we hope to do. So let me now bring our lovely panel together. And firstly, I would like to thank them all for joining us from a variety of different time zones, especially Kaylee, who is in Washington, DC, where the eyes of the world are right now. And I promise you their eyes of the world are right there because they know she's talking about this manifesto for no other reason. But it's also 4:30 in the morning there. So Kaylee, thank you for joining us at that time. I hope you have lots of coffee to keep you going. So our first, I'll go through and introduce all our panelists, and then we'll move on to some questions and then go to Q&A with our attendees. So let me start by introducing Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, who is currently Head of Public Programs with the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Renwick Gallery. She's responsible for leading new outreach and inclusion initiatives towards developing new audiences and cultivating public engagement. Kaylee is a cultural equity and audience engagement strategist with over 10 years of museum and nonprofit experience at the intersections of social justice and racial equity. Her areas of expertise include program development, policy change, strategic planning in museums. In the wake of COVID-19, she has led the internal task force towards reopening, planning, and strategies. Next, we have Sarah Smed. Sarah Smed is the head of the Danish Welfare Museum. Nice wave there, thank you. She is a trained historian and has since 2010 overseen both the museum's curatorial and educational programs, creating participatory, co-produced social history projects focusing on social justice, social change, and museum activism. Sarah works across agencies and professions, between sustainable partnerships and public NGOs and educational institutions, as well as closely collaborating with people with lived experience and professionals from the welfare system. She is a public debater and involved in welfare-related and museological issues, and terms herself activist, feminist, and optimist. In 2019, the Danish Prime Minister gave a national apology to care leavers on the ground of research carried out by the Danish Welfare Museum. And at the ceremony, Sarah Smed was invited to give a public speech. In 2020, an investigation into special care in institutions was launched by the Danish government, an investigation which Sarah Smed is currently leading at the museum. Finally, we have David Anderson, who, sorry, my notes just went a bit weird there. Our final panelist is David Anderson as Director General of Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museums Wales, who I've had the pleasure to collaborate with on developing this manifesto alongside Sharon, as I had mentioned earlier. David was commissioned by the UK government to write the first ever comprehensive report on the museum education called A Commonwealth, Museums in the Learning Age, which is where this manifesto's journey started. We began to explore where we've come in 20 plus years. It was first published in 1997. David first worked as a history teacher in a state school. He then began his museum career as an educator at the Royal Pavilion and Museums Brighton before moving to the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, and then the V&A, where he was Director of Learning and Interpretation in 2010. In 2010, he joined Amgueddfa Cymru, National Museums Wales, where he was overseeing the transformation of the St Fagans Museum to become the National Museum of History for Wales, and the development of new programs and research on the role of museums in society, including initiatives to address the impacts of poverty on children through cultural participation. He has also established a research department to support both curatorial and learning research. He is committed to the development of cultural rights, cultural democracy through museums. And an interesting point that I learned when reading his bio is he's written 2 children's books, which I'll be taking a look at later on. So I want to go to our panel and start with a question for them. But before I do that, I want to pose a question to all our attendees. It's a question that we come back to regularly on the last 19 months of this journey. And that is, why do we need a manifesto for learning and engagement? I would love for you guys to start this conversation in the chat. Maybe it might make you think of some other questions you'd like to ask our panel as we go through, but please do put your questions in the Q&A box because that's where I'll be looking for them. So to the panel, I pose this question, which is, If you could shortly and briefly as you can, talk about some context of the work that in your institutions and yourselves, think about your top line thoughts in relation to the manifesto itself. And I'm going to start with Kaylee. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Dikshana. And thank you for that starter question. I'd like to start first by also adding to my bio that my institution has reopened. So we are activating those strategies that we were anxiously working through the last few months. And that also for the past 6 months and through the end of the year, I've been working on a detail with another Smithsonian institution, the Anacostia Community Museum. And I just bring that up because I'm going to talk about that work in a little bit. And so I thought I would talk about my work briefly and how it relates to the manifesto and how I see the manifesto helping my work and my process to grow. And so, as you said, social justice has been a part of my museum work my entire career. I've approached museums since early on when I was in my graduate studies program at GW with a critical race lens. I had always had critical race studies as a part of undergrad, and then was a bit of a culture shock and a disappointment that critical race wasn't readily available in grad school. And I think that's where I really started to begin to challenge what are quote unquote museum practices, what are museum practices and what are not museum practices. I have witnessed very early on this distinction between museum work and race work that I just don't agree with. I believe museum work is race work. And again, I'll be talking specifically about my experiences, which are really from American museums. So I'm sure there are other perspectives in this as well. But my view of museum work is that museums are inherently cultural equity institutions, and I've always approached my work as such. And so there were 3 components of the manifesto that I think I really connected with, and that is social justice, activism, and community participation. And so early on in my career at the David C. Driscoll Center for the Study of Visual Arts and Culture of African Americans and the African diaspora, the Driscoll Center, the activist work that's happening there is really in representation in American art, but in art worldwide for African American artists. And so that mission, that core activism really leads the work that's happening. And you'll see a theme here in representation and in direct activism in museums, which I also know is somewhat unusual. Not everyone has had the opportunity to work at specifically an activist museum. I've specifically sought these opportunities out, and so where that weaving of social justice, activism, and community participation came into that work for me was really elevating student access and student voice in the center. The center has a very extensive and rich collection that is really an asset for students, students of all studies, not just art and art history. And so that was the crux of my work. There was really taking this taking this institution and broadening the audiences to really include students as it is sitting on a university campus. The next institution where social justice was really direct in my work was at the National Museum of Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C. Again, that museum is pushing representation issues of women who make up, this is an old statistic, but less than 10% of American collections nationwide. So, you know, a very big issue there, considering actually in the US, women are 51% of the population, so it's not even just 50-50. So the museum, Women in the Arts, was launched actually with an activist arm built into the mission that hadn't been fully utilized, fully expressed from the beginning, the founding of the museum. And so I was brought in to launch an initiative that would directly elevate that part of the mission, and it was called Women, Arts, and Social Change. And the approach there was to really connect the museum to the larger national and international conversation around progressive feminism, and that really was the goal. And so I launched programming that brought in thought leaders and experts across a wide variety of industries, not just arts, so science and technology, who would come into the museum and have really dynamic panel discussions and encourage visitors to participate in those conversations. And I'd say that the point of museum work, you know, quote unquote museum work, that we were really challenging with that project was breaking this sort of obsessive mold around objects must lead programming, objects must lead museum work. And instead of objects leading museum work, we were looking towards ideas and specifically activism to lead museum work. And so none of the programs that I produced were related in any way to an object in the collection. And that was done very intentionally and purposefully. And definitely raised some eyebrows around what are you doing? That's not really museum work. And then the next institution where I had a direct, very direct connection to social justice work was at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. I think this is my image is related to this one. If I can remember correctly, the image that I sent. And so the National Museum of African American History and Culture, of course, is another museum that's directly challenging representational issues. Again, there's that theme of representation coming up again. I'd say the difference there is that the museum was launched under the directorship of Lonnie Bunch, who is now the secretary of the Smithsonian. He oversees the whole Smithsonian, all of us. He very boldly and directly declared the museum an activist museum. And so everyone at NMAC is doing social justice work. Everyone is engaged in activism. And that definitely changes. It changes the role. It changes the struggle, the internal struggle that we sometimes feel like we're facing with trying to do this work in a museum setting. It was intentionally and purposefully built in. And so that, if you imagine that, of course, opened a lot of opportunities for programming. And so the programming that I was doing there really focused on building community and expanding the museum's active participation in national conversations on race. But I'd say that the building community part was possibly the most enlightening and surprising and fulfilling and rewarding. The setup, the concept of a seat at the table, which was the program that I launched, was a family style supper with strangers discussing social justice issues, which sounds like, it shouldn't work. I think the holiday that most Americans associate, food and family and disgruntled conversation is Thanksgiving here, which is a very fraught holiday, and we don't have time to discuss that. But it sounds like, a terrible Thanksgiving idea, but it really works. And using the familiarity of food and conversation was really a driving force for building community, and it was a very rewarding experience. And then I can see I'm coming up on my time, so I'm going to skip ahead to the work that I'm doing on detail right now, to Anacostia Community Museum, which is beginning to launch a 5-year initiative on racial equity that is centered in co-development with community. And this is really exciting to me because it's really pushing the concept of the museum is a site to build community power, and it is intentionally built into organizing theory and activism and social justice as well. And I think I'll just stop there.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself there. Thank you very much, Kaylee. And that was really insightful. I've got lots of notes and questions. I'm sure others do as well. So I'm just going to move over to Sarah, if you'd like to do your section now.
And I'm unmuted as well. Hello, everyone. And thank you for this brilliant intro from both you, Dikshana, and you, Kaylee. And thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on this and be part of this this launch. I think it's both empowering and humbling for a Dane sitting far, far away in a small country. So thank you for this opportunity. I'm the head of a rather small museum, and this rather small museum resides in a rather small country. But we are also an ambitious country, and we're also an ambitious museum. So the Danish Welfare Museum, despite or maybe because of its size, has proven to be within the last, especially 10 years, a factor in the Danish museum sector. A factor in the way that we, in collaboration with the people we create the museum with, are challenging what in a Danish context is and can a museum be. The Danish Welfare Museum is placed in the last preserved and the only what's the word in English? Well, the best preserved work and poorhouse in the Nordic country. And this work and poorhouse is it's built in 1872, and it was shut down in 1974. So it's like a prism in time where you can, when you visit the place, you can transcend in time, but also transcend in the way that you, at specific times in history, have looked upon which help was and should be the best for the people who were experiencing poverty, unemployment, homelessness, mental illness, physical illness, and so on and so forth. But what we do, and what I will give some examples on, is that we have taken this physical prism of a heritage site and said, with the people we are creating this museum with, who themselves are people experiencing the welfare state in contemporary society in Denmark, how are we doing today? And I'm smiling because this is maybe a personal strategy of mine, because we're not coping that very well in a Danish context. We are, of course, a country which I'm proud to say has very high life quality in many ways, but the inequality is rising, and the way that people who are living lives on the margins of on society, they are deepening. So we are an important museum in the very context of contemporary Danish society. So we are co-creating this, as I mentioned earlier, this museum with the very people who, when they share their experiences from, for example, children's homes, institutions, shelters, and so on and so forth, we are with them stating that this experienced level of knowledge is as much, and I would say even more so, an important part of Danish welfare history in general. So we can not only look at government level or state level or legal level or institutional level, we have to look at the very experiences connected to these places, because when listening to these this insight, which will be shared with us and which is shared with us continuously, it empowers both citizens in general, but it enlightens the very people who are working within the sector to this very day. And also, what is very important, it gives a forum where people who themselves have been experiencing this part of Danish welfare history, a sense of not being alone. This is an image which has just popped up from last year, where we, instead of putting the museum wording on the entrance, we instead in Danish have put the words, "We will not forget you." Vi glemmer jer ikke. And the person unveiling this with me is the head of the Danish Care Leavers Institution, who we, with them, were striving for this recognition from government that the way that they were treated in 40s, 50s and 60s and early 70s were without any question abuse. So this is an obligation, and that is why I'm very pleased to see this so ambitious manifesto, because that's also an obligation in which we can take with us. You can take it with you in a British context, but I can also take this with me as a part of a fellowship of museum workers striving for creating change and using the opportunities that we have in our institutions to create this very change. In the Danish Welfare Museum, we are in solidarity with these people who are sharing their knowledges with us and their insight. As I mentioned 2 times, and I'll mention it for the 3rd time because it's so important, we are creating the very museum in itself. And they are with us in a community, in a museum community, addressing issues concerning social justice, museum activism, and social change. I was so happy also to see in the manifesto that the very essence of who's doing the work, the workforce, is also a part, because that is what I would really stress has been an important lesson in the way that we have developed the museum, that we need not to do these collaboratory projects in just parts of the museum. We need the very people to be who we will be inspired from, and who we feel the obligation with in solidarity to create this change. We need them to see and to know that they should be part of the very museum workforce itself. Because in that way, we are not only creating a possibility to make change for the people themselves, for example, people who have experienced this welfare institutional life on a more negative note, or on society in general, but we are also creating change for the museum itself, making a reflective practice that we can take with us in the future and secure our relevance within this. So I would love also to stress here in this context that I see museums and also the museum that I represent as I actually wrote in my notes that we have such a treasure chest of opportunities to create change, and I really feel that this manifesto will open the lid, and we can look into all these treasures that are maybe hiding down there, and we can take them up and we can do something with them. And in this way, the museums can be instigators of social change. And what we also can explore, and what we are exploring in the Danish Welfare Museum, is how can museums also innovate the field of, for example, user-led welfare challenges, but also user-led welfare possibilities for the people who are in desperate need of us, society in general thinking new ways and thinking more creatively with them. And in this way, if we can do this while activating the museum resources in itself, I really think that the treasure chest should just stay, the lid should just stay open. So we are striving in a Danish context to create continuously a museum which is important, which is relevant, and the more that we know that the value, the true value lies within the fact that people who have this experienced knowledge, they're actually the ones who should lead the way, and us as museum staff members should just grab the opportunity and grab the possibility and go on with them. Because in this way, we are in unity with them, in solidarity, we are creating what can be a useful museum. And usefulness is, at this point in time, I must say, one of the most important factors in my work. We are funded. Yes, we are. Funding is such an issue in Danish context too. We are challenged in so many ways, but we're also extremely useful if we dare and if we're brave enough to open this lid to the treasure chest. So I'm not ending quite now. Dikshana, just give me a few more minutes, but I just want to share a few points connected to just when I first got the opportunity to read this manifesto, what really came into my mind. It really struck me that this represents such a possibility to also raise the bar and for us to step up. I hope I'm using the proper English terminology, but reading this manifesto is, in my view, so inspirational of what it represents. It doesn't represent a lot of work. It doesn't represent a lot of challenging thoughts. It does that as well, but that's not the real point. The point is that just reading it, the ideas just pop in my head all the time, and that's just, thank you for inviting me to take this part. And it's also stating with much proof the very essence of why we're here, why do we have museums, and what can we do. And I will combine that with who should we do it with and who can we do it with. There is an abundance of possibilities in this point, and I will stress again the workforce element, along with all the other elements, are truly some of the really strong points in my view, because the more we have broadened who we are creating the museum with, the more relevant and the more of a museum factor to be counted on a Danish level we have become. despite the fact that we are very small, we are a small museum, we do not have a lot of funding and we do not have a lot of staff members, but we have a lot of people wanting to create the museum's usefulness with us. So we really need to do our bit now internationally to narrow the gap, which you mentioned in the intro to the manifesto, that it is widening. We need to do our bit to narrow the gap between the people who we are inhabiting this very world with. And it is a call to action, and it makes me so happy to be part of this launch, because I'm sure that we will all leave here with a bit of, as I mentioned in an earlier meeting, with a bit of non-pollutive fuel for change running in our veins when it's very much needed. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to move on to David, and then I can see questions are popping up already, so please do add them, and then we'll move to the questions after David has done his introduction. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Dikshana. I just want to remind us that museums don't have to be buildings. They are really a way of thinking and acting in the world, with special cases which can include buildings. I won't talk about St Fagans Museum of History in Wales, because there's already been a tour earlier this week of St Fagans, and it will be available online. But I do want to really echo what the previous two speakers have said about the purpose of museums and social justice. That is the purpose. That is the major purpose, and everything else should be supporting that, not the other way around. And the ideal museum would be a selfless organization in the service of society, not an egotistical organization, which very many museums remain to be. It could be said that this manifesto is utopian. Let's embrace that label if that's what's offered, because the whole concept of a museum is about change in society. For many publicly funded museums in the 19th century, they were set up with some version of change, even if it was paternalistic, around the idea of improvement of the working classes. We don't have to embrace the purpose of the model that was there, but have to acknowledge that just by spending public money, there is an implication of change. We have to own that change. We have to describe that change, and it is social justice. We also need to know that very early on, there were some brilliant critics of the museums that had emerged during the 19th century. Just read William Morris's novel, News from Nowhere, utopian novel, and just read it with a museum lens, a museum spectacles on, and you will see how deeply critical he is of the museums of the time, full of scorn. And he was writing by then as a communist writer in this. Find Patrick Geddis's 1904 book, City Development, in which he reimagined the city of Dunfermline being communally rebuilt through cultural participation of all its citizens, the entire city. It's an incredible vision with an ambition that we've never really seen since for culture in a city. He said of museums that he had no patience with the metal masterpieces in a glass case, and the smithy, the place where the ironwork was done, nowhere. In other words, it's in the making, it's in the participation, right back in 1904. So this is a question that's haunted me for at least 30 years of working in museums. How can we justify a sector that is elitist and excluding in its core priorities and practices, and is anti-intellectual in its disregard for research on learning and society in the core of what it does? It's not the image that museums like to present of being anti-intellectual, but it is the truth when it comes to the social sciences and the impacts work. So the report to which Dikshana has referred to, A Commonwealth, privately for me at the time was to attempt to answer that question. Can we justify museums? Is there a good reason for having museums in society? And in which case, can they be different from what they are? And it was an attempt also to give learning an equal status in the functions of museums. Within a few years of its publication in 1997 and another edition in 1999, I saw that the barrier to change is not lack of research, because as I said, very many in the sector disregard the research on society in their work, but actually cultural resistance, political resistance. So in 2005, I looked for a legal framework for change and found the UN Declaration of Human Rights and the commitment to cultural rights, which is core to that every person has the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. Every person has the right to participate in the cultural life of the community. And so I tried to make an argument for how museums could enable that right to be fulfilled. And found, again, really, that this is a very rich source of thought, and wondered why it is that the museum sector, and particularly the leadership of the museum sector, never talks about cultural rights. Why is it not discussed? And the answer has to be that for the sector, it seemed to be too difficult, too challenging, too much away from what many in the sector wish it to be among the leadership. But we need our leading sector bodies to speak out loudly, and this manifesto speaks out loudly. The Museums Association has done that. When I moved to Wales 10 years ago, I found there inspirational Welsh traditions of communitarian participation. And Sarah, Wales, I'm representing in this session today another small country, Wales, with a population of 3.5 million people, but a very strong cultural identity, and that includes a tradition of communitarian participation and social justice. So I think we need 3 legs to the stool we must use: cultural rights, research-based learning, public participation, all driving social justice. And I think the manifesto is a remarkable document. It does draw on decades of research and practice, but it distills this with brevity, and it wears it lightly and makes it highly accessible. It is clear, strong, and unequivocal in what we must do. It speaks to the tumultuous times we live in. It's also our promise to the future and the standard against which the future should measure us, because the words are there, the promise is there, the commitment is there. We now have to do it. So I want to look forward and celebrate the manifesto, and also be very clear this is a manifesto for museums as institutions, and it's not just for the learning and engagement staff who they may or may not employ. This is the whole organization and everything they do. And we must talk also about some of the challenges that must be addressed if we're to be successful in implementing this manifesto. And I want to talk about 3, all in a sense are about the culture and practice of museums. The first one is, for us, where we are at the moment, within the 4 nations of the United Kingdom, the Anglocentrism of our museum education practice. Secondly, museums should be centres for epistemic injustice. And thirdly, the structural inequality between the nations on these islands. And I speak again from a nation that has just 3.5 million people. Could I have the first image, please? This is an image called Working Mothers and Daughters. And it was a textile panel created by the Arapayeyo Refuge for Girls in Dakar in 1993. Why is it here? Because a few years earlier, Shireen Akbar, the Victoria and Albert Museum's South Asian Arts Education Officer, had started a project called Shamiana, the Mughal Tent, a textile panel project for South Asian women's groups, first in London, but then remarkably and extraordinarily and unpredictably, it spread from London across the other nations of the UK, it spread into Europe, it spread to South Africa, it spread to the Middle East, and it spread to South Asia and other parts of the world as well. And it spread not because Shireen or the V&A tried to make it do so, it spread by word of mouth through family and friendship networks that were global. And one of the things that was extraordinary about it was that every group that participated worked through group learning, not through individual panels. And I talked to Shireen about it at the time. And Shireen very sadly died in 1997, very young. And she said that group learning was intrinsic to the practice of many in Bangladesh, where she was from. And I learned then that from Professor Lalaji Bowen, Professor of Adult Education in Glasgow, what I had never known before, that much of the innovation in adult learning on these islands has come from adult education practice in Africa and Asia. And in fact, we owe a huge debt to the practice that's been brought. But it makes me then wonder, have we learned to call on the rich heritage of learning traditions that are too often around us in the communities in our nations in the UK, but are not adequately understood or respected and are not adequately deployed as well? We need to take away our Anglocentrism in our museum education practice. Could I have the next image, please? This book has been an inspiration to me for 15 years or so now. In July 2019, Adhaf Soaef resigned as a trustee of the British Museum. This is what she said: "My resignation was not in protest at a single issue. It was a cumulative response to the museum's immovability on issues of critical concern to the people who should be its core constituency, the young and the less privileged." This book explores the philosophy of injustice and its negative impacts on those who experience it. Miranda Fricker, the author, describes the injustice that arises when someone is wronged, specifically in their capacity as a knower. She takes Harper Lee's novel To Kill a Mockingbird as the central motif for many of her philosophical discussions. And in this book, it's inconceivable for a white jury to believe a black man against the testimonies of others. So inconceivable that it is never even a possibility in the trial. And so she points out that conveying what one knows to others by telling and making sense of social experiences are two of our most basic epistemic practices. And she argues that the social identity of historically powerless groups, for example, women, racialized communities and working class people, is a constant daily source of such injustice. And that she says that if one experiences testimonial injustice that denies the validity of what someone knows because of who they are in society, this causes huge and lasting damage to the point for many people where they are silenced. And she says that this is happening all around us in our society all the time. So I would ask, in our museums, is this how we behave with our publics? Do we disregard and disrespect them as knowers? And what harm are we inflicting by doing so? Where is the public voice? Which public voice? And how is it enabled? Could I have the next image, please? This is within Wales now a notorious image that was used by the British Council under their Britain is Great, in this case, sub-labelled Rugby is Great campaign. The Welsh government, not the English government, is wholly responsible for policy and funding of culture in museums in Wales, and education, and health, and social care, and almost everything else in our daily lives. Devolution happened 20 years ago. The empire may have gone, but the London centrism of the sector bodies remains largely in place. The othering of Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland can be said to apply to the north of England, the West Country, and other regions of England too. Public opinion shows that a clear majority now are in favour of independence for Scotland. A minority, but a rapidly growing number demand independence in Wales. And in Ireland, there's a growing risk of conflict from Brexit. But the governance of the British Council, the National Museum Directors Conference, the Museum Association, other cultural organisations remains determinedly controlled from London. Many, many people in the cultural sector in Wales do not want to be labelled British in the way that the British Council does here by claiming the Welsh rugby team. For us in the cultural sector in Wales, no one in London is our centre. We are no one's periphery. We want the respect of being ourselves. And therefore, I would ask you, please, reflect carefully in future before you use the word British of us. In conclusion, since early this year, many in our society have been on a journey of impoverishment, isolation, and for some, the irrecoverable heartbreak of the loss of loved ones. How have museums responded? In essence, each museum has revealed its true identity, its underlying social philosophy. Some have been creative and determined in taking their services through community partners and participative digital services to the communities that need them most. Others have hidden behind a digital information wall. It's been a journey of contrasting democratic and undemocratic practices. So where is the light to guide us? This new manifesto provides such a light as we go forward through the darkness of COVID towards a new future. Is this optimistic? Yes. Is it in a sense utopian? Yes. But as someone said, a world without utopias is a world without social hope. So let us put our faith in the manifesto and use it to give hope to our communities and hope also to us in the sector. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all of you. I'm really conscious of time, and there's quite a few questions that have popped out. Some of them are very specific to some of our panelists, so I'm going to be a bit cheeky here and ask our panelists to have a look at them and see if they can answer them directly, because I did just want to bring it back to the next steps after the launch of this manifesto. And following the chat, although it moved fast, I'm going to admit, even for my eyes, there's a lot of really amazing thoughts coming out of it and key questions, but something that is coming out is this idea of implementation of the manifesto. How do you, if you aren't the top of your organization, how do you implement it? And there's two key things. How do you implement it? And how do you convince your whole organization learning and engagement is everyone's job? So I'm going to ask the panel if they could succinctly and maybe give one key kind of point for each of those. What's the key thing that you would say for implementation if you're not at the top of your organization? And what's the key thing that you would say to bring everyone on the journey of learning and engagement within your organization? If I could start with Kaylee.
Yes, well, this is a good question for me because I'm not at the top of my organization. Yes, so I think that the manifesto really provides a tool that you can utilize to build your roadmap for your approach to cultural equity in your department and grow that in cross department collaborations with the different sections within the manifesto. It provides a clear but not limiting view of the why we take up space as museums. Why do we use public funds? Why do we exist? Why should we be working? And for me, I see myself utilizing the manifesto to really to broaden the case for racial equity. And by that I mean in American museums, we have been using the framework of diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, DEIA, for quite some time without really moving the needle very much with that framework. And over the last few years, one of the things I didn't talk about was the Museum a Site for Social Action. I encourage you to visit museumaction.org, a grassroots organization pushing museums forward. In the last few years of my work, I've really transitioned out of DEAI into racial equity, and that is very much influenced from the movement for Black Lives, which as a theory of change says that we should begin with Black, queer, trans, otherwise othered, marginalized people, rather than start from a white Anglo norm and try to build inclusion in. And I see the manifesto really helping me to push the call for racial equity as the framework for still achieving the same goals as DEAI, but forcing us to reframe how we build that power and who we build that power within.
Very much, Kaylee. Sarah, would you like to, so just to reiterate the question, how do we implement this manifesto and how do we make sure that it's across a whole organization, not just within a learning and engagement team?
I'm sorry, but I'm really not the right person to answer this question, as I come from a very flat structured museum in a very liberal country where we have a tradition of challenging power structures. But just to be on the clear side, we do need a lot of work and support in a Danish context for the whole of the museum sector to see the possibility in working strategically in the in the very ambitious manner that the manifesto outlays. So we have just actually, I wrote my note here. I just wrote, just do it. Honestly, it's what we have been doing for the last 10 years, and we've just been doing it. And I think there is a strength in being a small museum, having a possibility to maneuver very easily to what is relevant, what is important, what issues need to be addressed. And there was a question in the Q&A where it was said, I can't remember it word by word, but working with people who themselves in contemporary society, with these people's stories of where they represent experiences from homelessness, isolation, disabilities, and so on. I will then combine my just do it with them. It's very easy. Don't have the don't. I think there's a expression that in English, I might step on some toes. I hope I won't. But we need to get off our high horses and just do it with them, because it's just important to get ahead. And sometimes, if you're just doing it, you have examples that the public and board members and CEOs and so on can see. This is both pushing the museum forward. We are being relevant, and we will show a success. And it's difficult not to be part of something which is significant, which is on the agenda when you're just doing it. It's difficult. I believe it's not black and white, but it's difficult not to say, well, okay, this is doing something for the organization. Let's go for it. So my point would be, just do it and show the potential and show the strength that there is in having an agenda and being courageous, which some people would say this is an example of bravery or courage. For me, it's just being part of society and showing that you are sharing the responsibility to create change.
I think even though you said you couldn't answer it, that was a very good answer. Okay. I think, yeah, just do it and do it with them. And then a quote that keeps getting said from conference this week is something that Esme Ward said, which is, let's do our thinking in public. And I think that reiterates just exactly what you said as well. So I think that's important. David, and we are really close to the end. So David, if you'd like to try and answer the question as well.
I'll be very brief. When I was at the V&A, one of my directors said publicly in the press, the public does not want education. So I've been there. I would say, believe in yourself, don't lose your voice, because that's exactly the epistemic injustice that I tried to refer to. Build alliances inside and outside the organization with people who share your values, because there will be plenty. They're there to be found. And with luck, that'll mean that you can be stronger with them than you would be on your own.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David, and thank you to all our panelists. I'm just going to round up with a final few things. I know we're slightly over, Rebecca, so do bear with me. Firstly, thank you to all our speakers. Thank you for preparing, sharing your examples. There were some real specific questions about your programs. We're collating those and we might come back to you to answer them, so we can go back to the attendees and answer those. Thank you to GEM, Engage and Art Fund for their collaboration and support on this work. I just want to make a note that the Museum Association has partnered with UK Research and Innovation and the Liminal Space to launch a £200,000 digital innovation engagement fund, which might help you advocate. Money is always a good thing to advocate for the work that you want to do. So please do check it out. Rebecca's going to drop a link to that in the chat. This is just the start, and I do hope that you will all go away inspired to think about how this manifesto could work for you, with the real practical examples of the case studies and what you've heard from our speakers today, as well as the practical ways to advocate and implement the manifesto. What you should know, and I just want to, it's just come out in those final answers, is that you're not alone in what you do. The manifesto is there to support you, it's there to back you. I like to think about the networks that I'm part of, like Museum Detox. I walk into any room with 200 people behind me. You walk into any room that you need to convince an organization about learning and engagement, that you have a manifesto behind you and an organizations like the Museums Association behind you supporting that. I do hope you're inspired by it, and we're great to keep this conversation going on social media. Please keep sharing your case studies, your ideas. We'll be collaborating with German Engage over the next year to webinars focusing on each manifesto point, so we can come together again, focus in on specific manifesto points and think about how we do implement them and deliver them. That will lead us to the Liverpool conference, MA conference in 2021, which I hope that we'll be sitting in a real room, drinking real coffee all together. And I really am going to take Sarah's idea and be an optimist here, and that will happen. So I really look forward to seeing you there. For today, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Just to reiterate that, thank you everyone for the great discussion today, and obviously all our speakers and everyone who worked on the manifesto. Also, just to add, thanks to Stage Text and Vocalise for making this session really accessible today. You've got the link to the manifesto. Do take time to read it. And I know that you obviously couldn't do that at the same time as listening to the discussion. And if you want to chat on Twitter and carry this conversation on, then the hashtag is hashtag Museum Learning. Our next session starts at 11 and is called What Do We Mean by Decolonise? So I'm definitely going to be there and hope to see you there too. Until then, goodbye.